before has the conservative movement been this unified around a governing agenda. Obviously, President Trump, our movement standard bearer, is going to make the decisions on what those policy priorities are, who the people are in his administration. This project is in service to him and to future conservative presidents.
That was the president of the Heritage Foundation. His name is Kevin Roberts. On the support Project 2025 has from everyone on the right, but especially Donald Trump. We're back with Isaac, Mark, John, and Vaughn. Vaughn, this is so inextricably linked to Trump, but we, I guess, already know he's started to distance himself from it because it is not popular with a lot of voters.
Right. He has made the case that he doesn't know who the organization is or what the document says. And I do not know whether Donald Trump has read the 900 pages or not. But we know that, of course, he does know the key architects of Project 2025. He spoke at the Heritage Foundation dinner in 2022, foreshadowing their work. For all intents and purposes, a good number of these folks could be very much at the heart of even his administration, like Stephen Miller, who continues to serve as an advisor to him, as well as Project 2025. At the same time, Donald Trump would be the president of the United States, and he could use whatever he wanted out of Project 2025 or America First Policy Institute, the executive orders and other policies that they are coming up with. That group also consists of a lot of former allies. But for each of these organizations, they understand that Donald Trump can very much be a tool for them to ultimately execute on the policies that they have long sought to have be implemented. And so for Donald Trump, there is some separation, but I think that these organizations, including through this new report here, it is very clear that the organizations have every intention of being effective in 2025 in a way that they've acknowledged that they were ineffective in 2017 and 2018 out of the gate in coming up with policies and even personnel to wholly be able to operate the administration in an efficient way for 4 years.
John Heilemann, one of the things that has to happen, and it's fascinating because it's actually being led from cultural icons and cultural figures more than from political actors. Taraji P. Henson mentioned 2025. It's one of the most Googled political search terms. Is a case. A case must be prosecuted in front of the American people that the vast majority of Americans are opposed to everything on every one of these 900 pages.
Well, that's for sure. And I rarely ever want to take exception to anything Vaughn Hilliard says, but I will say that I will bet every dollar in your bank account, Nicole, that Donald Trump has not read 900 pages of this report. I do not mean to say that Donald Trump is not familiar with its aims or does not endorse it, or that his people have not worked on it, or that it's wasn't designed to allow him to carry out his vision. But I would bet, again, dollars to donuts, that Donald Trump hasn't read 900 pages in total in his entire life. He might not have read 90 pages in total in his entire life. That said, it is absolutely correct that on the cultural side, on the political side, on every side, when somebody lays out a vision for government that's this clear and this disturbing and this far outside the mainstream of what American voters want, it's imperative, absolutely imperative for all of those who are on Team Democracy, and I would say more narrowly in the context of a presidential campaign, on the part of the Biden re-election campaign, the Democratic National Committee, every part of the Democratic and progressive infrastructure, and the moderate infrastructure, not just the progressive ones, to try to raise the profile of what is in these documents and pin them to their owner. And that owner, despite, I'm sure, not having read 900 pages, their owner is Donald Trump. And I think it's one of the paramount strategic objectives for all of the allied opponents of the Trump agenda to make sure that no one in America on Election Day doesn't know what Project 2025 is and doesn't know who its papa is.
Papa. Oh, I love that. Someone said Papa, and it's not even 4:30 on Friday. Wait, I have an idea. It's dangerous, right, when you think of something on live TV, but let's just do this, Mark Elias. There's a story in the New York Times saying that some donors have paused their sizable multi-million-dollar donations. Why not start an effort to educate the country about Project 2025? Park the money there. I mean, it doesn't have to wait for any sort of anything else on the other side. And it feels like we have for for Trump something we didn't have in 16 or 20. We have detailed plans of the monstrous policy agenda he intends.
Yeah, and I think we need to divide that policy agenda into two pieces. There is the substantive policies, which honestly, I don't think Donald Trump cares about one way or the other. I suspect he's not even familiar, or if he is, he may agree or disagree with some of them. And then there are the process policies, and that's where Donald Trump sees the action, because the process pieces are what allows him to effectuate his desire to be a dictator, not for a day, not for a week, but to be an authoritarian ruler, that he can do whatever he wants and he can run government with his cronies in charge and have everyone in the executive branch at his beck and call. And he will go after his enemies. He will seek vengeance. He will unleash not just the Department of Justice, but, Nicole, it will be the IRS. It'll be DHS. It'll be permitting. And he wants to be able to control government to be at his as a tool of his corrupt vision of America. And so should people be putting tens of millions of dollars into educating the population about Project 2025? I'd say no, they should be putting billions of dollars into educating the population about 2025. The fact is, we are facing an existential crisis of democracy, and there is not the organized, coordinated, well-funded, serious effort to understand that the other side is not playing a game of propaganda. They are playing for keeps. And their idea of keeps is to undermine democracy for a generation or more.
If reelected, he will be a dictator on day one. And I will, quote, terminate the United States Constitution. Let us be very clear. Someone who suggests we should, quote, terminate our Constitution should never again have the chance to stand behind a microphone and never again have the chance to stand behind the seal of the President of the United States of America.
Prosecutors in the House, and no one can deliver a read on a criminal like an ex-prosecutor's. That was Vice President Kamala Harris at a campaign stop in Greensboro, North Carolina yesterday, highlighting the fundamental threat posed to all Americans by a second Trump term. It comes as allies of Kamala Harris have launched an effort to boost the vice president and defend her against more vicious attacks from Donald Trump, as uncertainty continues to swirl at some levels in some parts of the party about whether Joe Biden will remain at the top of the Democratic ticket. Joining our coverage, NBC News Washington correspondent, our colleague Yamiche Alcindor. John Heilemann is here. Yamiche, being Kamala Harris, this is the point in the calendar, we should say, where the vice president turns up the heat on their attacks on an incumbent president who's running for re-election. This is the point where more media start traveling with the vice president. It is often a vice president's job to be the political surrogate so that a president can still president. But this year is anything but normal. Tell me what it has been like for her on the trail.
Well, she's really been put in this awkward position, but this also prominent position to really be the lead defender of President Biden in this moment where so many people are questioning whether or not he should stay in this race. And from the very beginning of what was really been this sort of dismal few days for President Biden, she was there sort of really outlining the talking points the Democrats have used now since that debate. So in the moments after the debate, I was told by a number of sources that she didn't have talking points. There wasn't sort of a roadmap for how to deal with the president's poor debate performance. And she went on and said, you know what, he shouldn't be judged for the last 90 seconds. He should be judged for the last 3 years. And it's that thesis that she articulated as a prosecutor, really prosecuting the case against former President Trump, pointing out that she thought he was a liar and the biggest threat to democracy, and that's where the focus should be. That has been something that the president himself has repeated, but also that she has repeated. She's also been traveling to a number of states, about 6 states, including twice to Nevada just in the last few week here. And she's really been going out, calling people, calling elected officials, calling donors, calling civil rights activists, really making the case over and over again that President Biden should still remain the top of the ticket. period. And she's doing this as she's starting to get more intense support for people to say, well, you know what, if Joe Biden does step down, there's no one else that should come but Kamala Harris. And there are a number of people, Black Democrats in particular, but I say donors. I was just on the phone with a big donor group that's really launched millions of dollars in bolstering her in this moment, and looking at research and doing polls just in the last week and a half on her particular, talking about the fact that she is focusing and has a sort of ability to mobilize young voters and voters of color in particular. But the K-Hive is getting started, right? You have all these people that are sort of buzzing about her, but also she's still saying, look, I don't want to undermine the president. I want to be loyal. If he wants to stay in, I'm going to stay there with him. So while she's balancing all of this, it's been sort of a really, I think, wild point for her, but it's also been a point where she's stepped up and really shown strength and convinced some people who were really critical of her, who were really questioning whether or not she could be a president or she could be, even in 2028, someone the party could look to. A lot of those people have quieted down and say, yeah, we see in her a strength that would be good for the presidency.
Yeah, I mean, Yumi, she is very good at this. And I remember covering some of her events, and I remember thinking she was good at it 4 years ago as well. But Trump has done so many more terrible things. He's now a convicted felon. And she is, it sounds like in some instances, crafting some of the attacks, and they are landing. And I've watched the events from the speeches to the rope line. They are connecting. And whatever happens on the Democratic side, she is delivering the kinds of attacks against Donald Trump that are not just helpful, but urgently needed if there is any chance that the ticket closes the now yawning gap in some of the battlegrounds. What is the plan for how to deploy her?
Well, the plan right now for how to deploy her is to keep having her go out into the country and talk to voters directly. The Biden campaign, as well as people who are sort of bolstering and spending a lot of money, making sure that she's someone who is going to have protection from all of the incoming attacks, the increasing attacks, I should say, by Republicans who are really starting to put a target on her back as they see her get stronger. The plan is to really help protect her and help really explain to the American public who she is, her background, her history as a prosecutor, her history as a trailblazer, because, of course, it's not just that she was the first Black vice president, but she was the first statewide Black attorney general in California. She was only the second woman, from my understanding, to serve in the U.S. Senate. So she really has a lot of background and a profile that this campaign really wants to explain to the American people. And then on top of that, she's also a relationships person. So she is dealing with the internal conversations here when Democrats are wondering whether or not they can get behind Joe Biden. A lot of those times she's calling her former colleagues, because she served in Congress, to say, hey, we should stick with him. I appreciate the fact that you're saying maybe I should step in, but I'm someone who's going to ride with the president here. So she's really someone I think they're deploying both for voters, but also for donors and for people who are openly questioning, because she's also done a number of fundraisers in the last few weeks here. But I also want to point out one thing as you talk about sort of the messaging here. I wrote a story about her just a few days after the debate, and she was at a campaign rally, and she said this: one thing that's true before the debate and after the debate, these are Vice President Harris's words. She said, Donald Trump is still a liar. So that messaging that really is going after Donald Trump, she said he is still a liar. We still have to be focused on him. And it sort of underscores where her focus is and where her messaging is here.
You know, John Halman, an incumbent president always has a hard time running for re-election. And it's impossible if it is a choice, right? It has to be a referendum on the inadequacy of the alternative. She is executing that as though that is sort of her political theory of the case.
Yeah, well, yes. Although I think of that always as the opposite way, Nicole. It's like you have to take it from being a referendum on you and your performance, a up or down vote, right, to making it into a choice between you and the alternative.
Yeah.
In this case, you're trying to sort of turn it into a referendum on Donald Trump. And yes, I mean, look, the things that people have, I know you and I have watched her. I've known her since I've lived in San Francisco in the late 1990s when she was on the rise there, and I've always been impressed. And she always had a huge future. She's obviously, navigated the difficulties that every vice president in every administration I've ever covered, frankly, always has to navigate. And she's come through it on the other side has really grown into the office. She's obviously been helped ironically by the fact that the country was hurt by Dobbs by making that a central issue in Democratic politics. The smart move for Joe Biden was to assign her that issue. So it's given her a huge amount of visibility. It's given her a huge amount of profile that vice presidents normally don't get. And she's risen to that. And when people think, there are a lot of things to say about what's going on right now around the way people are thinking about, okay, if Biden were to step aside, who would be a successor? There's these questions around, does she deserve it just because she's his vice president? There's an argument to be made there. But if you put that aside and just think about what assets she brings, as they're the same assets as a vice president in this case, which is what you're talking about, they would be the same assets if she were to have to replace Joe Biden, which is to say, of all of those other very talented Democrats we talk about, none of them come with something as clear as the framing that she brings into either office, into either position on the ticket, which is, I'm a prosecutor, she's a prosecutor, he's a criminal. You can love Gretchen Whitmer, you can love Steve Beshear, you can love Gavin Newsom, you can love all of them. But if you had to replace Joe Biden at the top of the ticket, you would need to move fast. And one of the things you would not have for any of them would be the kind of clear frame that you have with her. Prosecutor, criminal. And she could fill that role in a heartbeat.
It is a claim that is breathtaking in both its audacity and its danger. From some of the very same people who are building the infrastructure to help Donald Trump tear down the very pillars of our democracy should he prevail in November and return to the White House. Allies of the ex-president, many affiliated with the right-wing Heritage Foundation, are now claiming that the candidate who will disrupt the peaceful transfer of power won't be the repeat offender, Donald Trump. No. In their telling, in their delusions, and in what amounts to an epic case of projection, they're accusing the Biden campaign of doing so. Stunning new reporting from the Washington Post on a discussion of supposed threats to the 2024 election by Trump allies reveals this, quote, the presentation delivered at the Heritage Foundation's Washington headquarters stated as a given that the Biden administration was already engaged in a sweeping conspiracy to use multiple forms of federal power to influence the presidential election. It did not supply any evidence. Quote, as things stand right now, there is a 0% chance of a free and fair election. That was Mike Howell, executive director of Heritage's Oversight Project. Quote, I'm formally accusing the Biden administration of creating the conditions that most reasonable policymakers and officials cannot in good conscience certify an election. Only one candidate and his supporters have done that, have refused to say if they will accept the results of the 2024 election, and it is not President Joe Biden or any Democrat.
President Trump, the question was, will you accept the results of the election, regardless of who wins? Yes or no, please.
If it's a fair and legal and good election, absolutely.
Will you accept the results of the 2024 election, no matter who wins?
Yeah, I'll accept it. I think, there's no massive cheating.
Senator, will you commit to accepting the election results of 2024? Bottom line.
Well, at the end of the day, the 47th president of the United States will be President Donald Trump, and I'm excited to get back to low inflation, low unemployment.
Wait, Senator, yes or no? Yes or no? Will you accept the election results of 2024, no matter who wins?
That is my statement.
Will you commit to accepting the results of this year's election?
Look, Dana, I totally plan to accept the results of 2024. I think that Donald Trump will be the victory. And if it's a free and fair election, Dana, I think every Republican will enthusiastically accept the results.
What about 2024? What about 2024?
We will see if this is a legal and valid election.
Stop right here for a second. Lifelong Republican Chris Krebs described the 2020 election as the, quote, most secure in America's history. Bill Barr said there was no evidence of fraud. So we have to think of this delusional and desperate but very strategic attempt to somehow rhetorically turn the tables on the Democrats, to depict them as the real threat to democracy as part of Big Lie 2.0. And if the first iteration of the big lie was used to justify everything from baseless lawsuits to the deadly violence that we saw on January 6th, this new version is no different, but perhaps more dangerous. Washington Post reports that a Heritage Foundation staffer said this, quote, "The exercise would lead Heritage to file more litigation over election procedures." He also said it should help the public resist, quote, "psychological operations" that he claimed were being used in 2020 and are being used again. He didn't say who supposedly ran the operations. Quote, "The upshot is that we will see a contested election, the likes of which we've never seen," said a professor who helped lead the simulation. Quote, "If we see the kind of manipulations we saw in 2020, I wonder if average Americans who are supporters of Donald Trump will swallow that so easily as they did in 2020. The idea that Trump supporters swallowed anything or took the 2020 election results for what they were, lying down, is absurd. We all saw what they did. We all saw what happened on January 6th. A mob of Trump supporters sent by Donald Trump stormed the United States Capitol, injured, maimed, and led to the deaths of police officers, came incredibly close to harming Vice President Mike Pence and his family as Trump supporters and members of the mob called for him to be hanged on sight." Now, in response to this so-called war game presented at the Heritage Foundation, the Biden campaign responded this way, quote, "This document is nothing more than an attempt to justify their efforts to suppress the vote, to undermine the election, and ultimately another January 6th. Attempts to sow doubt about the integrity of the 2024 election months ahead of Election Day by Trump's allies gaining steam is where we begin today with some of our most trusted reporters and friends. National political reporter for the Washington Post, Isaac Arnsdorf, is back. He's bylined on that reporting in the Washington Post we led with. Hello to someone's dog. Also joining us, voting rights attorney, founder of the site Democracy Docket, Mark Elias, is back. Chief political columnist and host of the podcast In Politic for Puck, MSNBC national affairs analyst John Heilman's here for the hour. And my friend and colleague, NBC News correspondent Vaughn Hilliard, is here. Isaac, since this is your reporting that inspired the way we are starting today, take me through what you and your colleagues are reporting.
Yeah, it was a little bit of a weird day at the Heritage Foundation yesterday afternoon. Didn't totally know what to expect with this transition integrity project, which was they described as like a simulation, like a role-playing game, where they had different people assigned to different parts to try to game out what might happen in the election. But part of what was so stunning about it was they reached the conclusion they reached to from that was that the sitting president, as they described their finding, the sitting president is the biggest danger to the peaceful transition of power. But that was as if Trump's efforts to overturn the 2020 election had never happened. And instead, they were talking about, as a given that it was already the case, never mind what they were predicting or imagining, but already the case, that somehow the Biden administration was engaged in using the Small Business Association and the Border Patrol and all levers of federal power, the Justice Department, somehow to influence the upcoming election. Although there was, the evidence that they provided for this, for example, was that they had sent a camera crew to a housing complex in the vicinity of Charlotte, North Carolina, and were asking people there if they were citizens and if they were registered to vote. And they said that some number of people said yes, but they never followed up to actually see if those were people who were actually registered to vote. And they were presenting that as proof of fraud.
John Heilman, there's something so insane about this that we sometimes brush it aside. We decided to lead with it, but I don't want to shave off the insanity, if you know where I'm heading here. So this is from the Post reporting. Barbra Streisand kidnapped by Hamas. Antifa, Black Lives Matter protesters taking over a migrant detention facility. The FBI arresting Donald Trump 2 days after winning the election. These were among the far-fetched scenarios imagined by a simulation of threats to the 2024 election, showcased on Thursday by the right-wing Heritage Foundation. In the 2024 project at Heritage, President Biden was played by former Senator Robert Torricelli. Those war games included contemplating surprise emergencies such as the Barbra Streisand kidnapping. We have spent 9 years, I think, maybe looking away from some of the most insane things that are planned. This is a plan that's on paper. This is a group that is inextricably linked with former Trump administration officials and people who are on lists to be future Trump administration officials should he prevail. Trump is ahead in most of the battlegrounds, and we thought today was a good day to really understand what the plans are for rigging the November election.
Well, I wanted to let you know, Nicole, that in my weekend war game exercise that I do over here at my place, you sometimes have come and done that. We're deciding between a body snatcher thing and a Martian invasion thing this weekend. So if you have a point of view about which one of those we should do, let me know. Yeah, I mean, I think this gets back to a theme that we have returned to of late, particularly because of the Project 2025 kind of exposure that it's been getting, not getting as much attention as some other stories recently, but the fact that the kind of cat's out of the bag, and I do think that it speaks to a lot of things here. It speaks to the way in which, first, it speaks to the total capture of all of these, not just of the MAGA movement, that the total capture of the Republican Party and all of the associated and ancillary extra campaign and political organizations. The Heritage Foundation, once upon a time, was a mainstream conservative organization in Washington, D.C. Now they are not just a MAGA organization, but they are doing war games of this kind, I think largely, maybe not large, let's say, but at least partially, to continue to curry favor with Donald Trump. These are like so much of this stuff is performative. And it's performative. These are new kinds of rituals, bizarre rituals that are enacted by previously respectable institutions in order to curry favor with the cult leader, with the dear leader, with Donald Trump. You do these things in order to get in his good graces and to maintain your credibility. I'm sure they have had this planned for a very long time. But as Trump distances himself, at least publicly, from some of their work, I bet they were really happy to be doing this. There's kind of there's a quality of this way, hey, you never know what's going to happen with Trump. We got to keep currying favor with him. And certainly, as we were talking the last time I was on the show, every element of this matches up to the description that we talked about that day where I'll recall an Atlantic writer, I'm sure, who said, that the January 6th insurrection was a dress rehearsal. This is literally a dress rehearsal, only it's kind of a cosplay dress rehearsal. It's kind of like the Renaissance weekend kind of a craziness, but it's still a dress rehearsal, and we still got to take it real seriously.
Hey there, MSNBC fans. I'm Luke Russert, and be sure to join me, Rachel Maddow, Jen Psaki, Lawrence O'Donnell, Steve Kornacki, Joy Reid, and many more September 7th in Brooklyn, MSNBC Live Democracy 2024. Click on the link for ticket information. We will see you there.